Hello, everyone. We'll be looking at the establishment of colonial Latin America, specifically looking at the Spanish Empire. We'll leave our look at Brazil and some of the French colonies for a later time. Just a touch of review, as we have discussed in class. It is honestly quite a feat that the Spanish were able to take down some of the major empires of the Americas, most notably the Aztec and the Inca, but we'll be reminded that there were multiple forces that made that happen. In the documentary Guns, Germs, and Steel, we saw that the superior weapons technology that the Spanish had, including their rapiers and their steel technologies, as well as their firearms, made that possible, as the isolated Americas had no access to that information. Likewise, the inheritance of information via the libraries and the writing surely helped, and probably the biggest reason for the dominance of the Spanish has to do with the spread of germs, and specifically the spread of smallpox to the Americas, depopulating these empires and allowing the Spanish to come to power. I would like to spend a little bit more time on the fall of the Aztecs, however, via some image analysis. So I first want to take a look at the Florentine Codex, which was published in 1577. And as we've said before with images like these, we have to be careful because they look like they're produced by the Aztecs, as we'll see in a second. But when you note the date, the Spanish are in full contact with the Aztecs at this point, and so these are created by Aztec priests and artists, but under Spanish supervision. Okay, so it'd always be a limited expression of Aztec information. Right, so this is one component of the Florentine Codex, which is looking at the meeting of the Aztecs and the Spanish for the first time. Right, so here we have Hernan Cortez, who is our conquistador, who was responsible for leading the charge against the Aztecs. And here we have Moctezuma, who was the emperor of the Aztecs at the time, although a new one. And it seems here, if we look, that we have a fairly peaceful meeting. Similar to the Inca, they didn't immediately begin to clash, that there were a series of negotiations originally. So we can see this in this fairly peaceful looking meeting. The one figure that I would like to point out that I want you to know who was very instrumental in this movement is the figure we see here, who is later known by the Spanish as Doña Marina, but is known as Melintzin or Malinche by the Native Americans of Mexico and modern Mexicans. She is very important because she served as the translator. She was a translator for the Spanish, specifically Cortez, from almost their arrival in Mexico when they come in the early 1500s. And she is so important in leading these negotiations between the Spanish and the other Native American tribes who had been conquered by the Aztecs, who eventually side with the Spanish and aid in the war against the Aztecs. To me, she's a really interesting figure, highlighting how messy this moment in history is. So the story of Malintzin, which was her original Mayan name, when she is baptized by the Spanish, they give her the Spanish name Marina, so she's given the honorary title Doña Marina. But later she's known as Malinche, and Inche in Spanish is often a suffix that is put onto terms and usually with a negative connotation. So Malinche, if you were to say that word in Mexico, it means traitor. So some people look at her as a traitor to her community, right, or to the Native American peoples of the Americas because she served as that translator, which ultimately led to the fall of the Aztecs and the full Spanish takeover of the Americas, really. But to me, she's very interesting because she's a reminder of just how divided the early pre-Columbian civilizations were at this time period. The story of Malinche is that she was born in the Yucatan, so she was born closer to Cancun, and that she was sold into slavery and traded as a slave for the entirety of her life. In the process of this, and as she's traded, she moves from like Cancun in Mexico eventually to the coast of Mexico near Veracruz. She ends up learning a lot of different languages as she lives in many communities, and this is why when Cortez learns of her, he immediately scrambles to buy her because a multilinguistic person is so important to this endeavor. She's sold to Cortez, and she eventually has a child with Cortez. So this is a really controversial moment because we have to wonder how much she did this willingly. Was she literally a slave her entire life, so was forced to translate, was essentially forced to marry and have a child with Cortez? It's hard to say, but to me, she encapsulates the controversy of this entire moment and how some people believe that some of the Native Americans were complicit in kind of the Spanish takeover of the Americas. She's also deemed the mother of the mestizo race, and we'll get to that term in just a little bit. Another look at the same moment comes later in the 20th century by Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. And we'll be looking at a lot of muralist art when studying the Mexican history because it's one of the greatest expressions of Mexican history. For a little bit of point of view background, Diego Rivera will paint mostly in the 20s and 30s, and he was a communist and an extreme nationalist, very proud of Mexican history, specifically indigenous history. And so his voice is definitely going to be one of anger and condemnation of the Spanish. So if we look at part of his mural, which is looking at the conquest of the Aztecs, we're seeing not only the story of Doña Marina in a kind of sadder way. So if you look, here she is. She has a child strapped to her back. And she definitely seems less powerful than in that original image. And here we see money exchanging hands, most likely Doña Marina being sold to Hernan Cortez. If we look at some of the faces of the Spaniards in this painting, we'll see that they're pretty ugly, kind of goblinish. This is something that Rivera would do to show his disdain for certain figures. So here we see the story of Doña Marina. Other things that we see in this mural are not only looking at the fall of the Aztecs and the rise of the Spanish, but also other elements of what we call the Columbian exchange, or the exchange of goods and plants and animals and ideas between the Old World and the New World. Obviously, one of those ideas that will be spread is Christianity. But via Diego Rivera's view of this, he looks at Christianity as a tool of oppression. As we see here, we have someone we'll learn later as Diego Rivera, who is wielding a sword while in front of a cross with this monk right here, forcibly converting these Native Americans. We can also see in the upper right-hand corner a bunch of stuff going on here. We see a lot of labor, some by Native Americans, so showing the negative treatment of them, some of them of African slaves, we actually can see over here. So the importation of African slaves is a demographic change happening in the Americas. We also can see the deforestation, so that's an environmental impact, and the planting of what will be cash crops that will make the Spanish very rich. We see as well in this corner the European animals that are brought for the first time to the Americas. So the cattle and the horses and the goats and the sheep. While that will help the productivity of the Americas, we also know that they are bringing the diseases. And lastly, in the bottom, we can see the mines that will be a cornerstone of the Spanish Empire's economy. We'll talk about the silver mines way more in depth later, but yet another element. And of course, we're seeing a lot of forced labor by African slaves. We can also see some slaves and Native Americans who are being hung in the trees. So this is definitely a way more negative look at the birth of the Spanish Empire. So once the Spanish conquer the Aztec and the Inca, and begin to take over more territory, this is the extent of the Spanish Empire known as New Spain. And that while they do have colonies in other parts of the world, this is definitely the heart of the Spanish Empire. So the territories extended from Florida and Southern California, Texas, all the way through Central America, and all the way down through Chile and Argentina. When they began to take over the territories, of course, we have to create a government that can manage all of these territories. And they did this by employing viceroys. So a viceroy is a regal official who ran the colony for the crown, right? So they're representing the crown. At every given moment, they're representing the crown. So there was a viceroy in Mexico City who represented the viceroyalty of New Spain. There was a viceroy in Bogota that was the representative of the viceroy of New Granada. There was a viceroy installed in Lima, which was the viceroy of New Castile, and a viceroy in Buenos Aires, who was the viceroy of La Plata. So every one of these viceroys, they were not independent. All of them reported back to the Spanish crown. But I would argue that one of the most important political tools was the creation of the colonial class system. This will be important for terms of power, but also it changes the way people talk about ethnicity and race. What we see is that the Spanish create a class system that equates race or ethnicity with power. And they get very specific in terms of the hierarchy of ethnicity and race. At the very top of this class system are the Peninsulares. So the Peninsulares are Europeans, but they are born in Spain, right? They were born in the Iberian Peninsula, which is where Spain is. And only Peninsulares got to be the viceroys. Only Peninsulares got to own large expanses of land and business. So only the Peninsulares got to be the top of the Spanish hierarchy. The Creoles occupied the second class, and even though they were 100% European, they were born in the New World, right? So this could be someone whose parents are Spanish, born in Spain, but because they were born in Mexico City or because they were born in Lima, they were considered Creoles or second class. They're still very rich and powerful, but they can never occupy the absolute top of any form of business or government. The reason for this is fear of loyalty. Right? Can we trust someone who's been born in a foreign land, or can we only trust people who are born in Spain, raised in Spain, and educated in Spain? What we'll see is that they're kind of right. It's the Creoles later on that we'll see that lead the independence movements in the age of revolution, right, after the American Revolution. And most of this, frankly, will be because they're tired of not getting to have the most privilege in society. And we'll get to all of that later. All right, but here we're even seeing, even if you have the same descendants, where you're born can even dictate your power. Then we have the mestizo, quote-unquote, race or mixed race. But we'll see, some people simply look at mestizo as being Native American and Spanish heritage, but it gets really, really specific and hierarchical. So depending on where you laid within that hierarchy, you could still be maybe somewhat rich and powerful, but you're definitely below the 100% European-born peoples. Underneath them would be Native Americans, most of which were working as like indentured servants. Then underneath the Native Americans would be the free blacks that through various means had bought their freedom. And of course, at the very bottom would be African slaves. So a little bit more on mestizos. So as I said, they found ways to categorize humans, ways that we have not seen before in human history. I would argue that a real sense of racism or assigning value based on your ethnicity is truly born in this era. So there'd be images to teach people who they were based on their ancestry. So this is a cartoon that was teaching people what a mestizo was. So it says, if you are Spanish and India or Indian, or Native American in this case, right, then you make a mestizo. So a Spaniard plus an Indian makes a mestizo. But then it gets even more complicated than that. We won't go through all of these, but this is the hierarchy of mestizos. So at the very top is the classic mestizo, right? So having a Spanish father and a Native American mother makes you a mestizo, right? If your parents are a mestizo father and a Spanish woman, then you're a castizo, and that's underneath a mestizo. If your father was castizo and your mother was española, then you are española, and continues to go on from there. If you have a Spanish or Español mother and a Mora father, which would be a North African father, then you're a mulatto, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. At the bottom, it gets a little crazy. Actually, let's close in right here. All right, so if you have a mulatta mother, which would be like North African and Spanish blended, and a Spanish father, Española, which is kind of similar, then you're a Morisco. But if you had a Morisco and an Española, then you're Chino. It just goes on and on forever. The one thing I find totally crazy is how some of the words end up being. So if you have a Salta Alta father, which is a blend of all the other things that we just said, including Indian, and a mulatta mother, then you are a Lobo. Lobo is a word for wolf. So they're kind of saying like you're a dog. So it gets pretty offensive. And if we get to the very, very bottom, essentially, if you are blended from African slaves, Chinese servants, and Indians, you're the lowest of the low, right? So even within the mestizo class, they 100% regimented and categorized people to consistently have a sense of power, right? So your ethnicity, your race equals your power, and they're very specific about this stuff. Another concept that I want you to be aware of, the concept of the hacienda. So the hacienda will be very important because what we see is that Latin America is very regionalized and very agricultural and rural, right? So they're kind of similar to the manors of the feudal era. They'd be self-contained agricultural estates that would provide everything for you. Some people would never leave their hacienda their entire life. The church would be there, the farms would be there, the mills would be there, everything you could ever need would be on the hacienda. So it did allow for a lot of regional rule. And the way people were able to get the land was through the encomienda system, which just generally speaking is a land grant system, which not only gave people land, so the Spaniards would grant land to the Spanish nobles who would settle that land. They would get the land as well as the people that lived on it. Those people would be expected to work on it. We have more information on this in a presentation, so I'll stop there, but at least wanted to put it into context. Another major cultural change, obviously, that is happening as a result of the rise of the Spanish is the rise of Roman Catholicism in Latin America. It's one of the longest lasting consequences of the Spanish takeover. Still today, Latin America is the majority of Catholics in the world and the place where the church is still growing at a consistent rate. Right, so the church expands in various ways. We're going to focus first on the more positive ways that the church grew throughout Latin America. One of those is via syncretism, which we've talked about before. Right, syncretism is when one culture is aligned with another. Sometimes that's done by missionaries, right? Let me see how I can make it seem like my religion is a lot like your original religion so that you'll convert, right? So aligning one culture with another with the hopes of converting them. But what's important about syncretism is that it ultimately creates something new, right? Adds something to that original religion, right? That's what makes it different from cultural diffusion. And so one of the ways that this happens, well, a few different ways that we'll get into, is by looking at how the indigenous people insert their beliefs and experiences into Catholicism, right? We're going to talk about that more in depth in just a little bit. But also, as we discussed in class, we have to remember that some of the missionaries worked to really protect the indigenous people. So as the politicians were abusing them, some of the churches really did work to protect them, such as we saw in the case of Bartolomé de las Casas. And so in gratitude and looking at them as good people, of course some people will convert to this new religion. Also, we have to remember the power of the Jesuits, right? That the Jesuits will open hospitals and schools, and so people will come to them for those services and then convert later on. And also, ultimately, there's no way to avoid the church in Latin America. It was the largest landowner, it was the richest institution, it owned everything. So just via contact, people would begin to convert. Of stories of syncretism, or the Native Americans really embracing and beginning to insert their images into Latin America, or into the church, is the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Right? So the Virgin of Guadalupe is probably the most important image in Latin American Catholicism. And the story is that there was a young priest, a Native American convert named Juan Diego, who was roaming around what is now Mexico City. And one day the Virgin Mary appeared to him and performed a series of miracles. And when he wanted to go back to town and to tell the people that she appeared to him and essentially encouraged him to convert more people to Catholicism, and he asked her, well, how I prove to people that you've come to me. And it said that she imprinted her image on his cloak, right? And this is the image that he brought back and is still on display at the sanctuary, at the pilgrimage site for the Virgin of Guadalupe. And what's important about this image is that this does not look like the European Mary. If you look, she has darker skin and darker hair, and so this is an indigenous Mary. And as we've seen many times before, people want their god or their gods to look like them. So this is a show that the Native American community is embracing Christianity, which will, of course, encourage more conversion and more groups to embrace the religion. On the other side, we do have very negative examples of the conversion of the Native American peoples, right? So sometimes we had forced conversions, if a community refused to, they might be subject to essentially the Inquisition. So we see many examples of what are called auto de fe, or rituals of public penance and forced conversion, when it seemed that Native American communities were refusing Christianity. One of the worst examples of this is the story of Diego de Landa, who was a Spanish priest who was sent to the Yucatan to deal with the Mayan people. Right? So the Mayan descended peoples were seen as less receptive to Christianity, and so he went there with the literal mission to convert them. But one of the sad stories is that when it seemed that he had, converted many people and that they had a stretch of peace where there was no rebellion, there was an incident in which one of the priests that served Diego de Landa had noticed that at night some of the Mayan indigenous people would sneak away to this cave. And then one day they investigated the cave, and what they found was an altar. And on this altar there were many offerings that the indigenous people were leaving, mostly just food and drink and things like that. But these statues on the altar frightened the Catholic priests. On one side of the altar was a statue of Jesus, right? So they were leaving images and offerings to Jesus. But on the other side was a statue of Satan, where they were leaving these, offerings to him. So of course they looked at this as a rejection of Christianity. They must be Satan worshippers. And so Diego de Landa freaks out and leads one of the biggest out to Deface and smashes so many Mayan artifacts and burns all these temples and kills all of these people. It was a really, really brutal event. But later, as anthropologists study this event, they wonder at how much of an overreaction this was. That if you think about how the Mayans might have perceived Christianity, that it seems that they were actually embracing it, right? Because it looks scary maybe for a priest to see the Mayans worshiping Satan, but we have to remember the way that the original American faiths worked. Remember, the early Mayan gods, just like the Aztec gods, were not only good or only bad, right? That a god could be good and bad at the same time, right? And that they left offerings to their gods in the hope to please them so that bad things wouldn't happen. So if they're preaching on one hand, right, give offerings to Jesus, he's good and he will help you. But then they hear of this figure of the devil who can bring so much harm. Considering their past practices, of course they're going to leave offerings to the devil. They want to fend the devil off. They want to keep him happy so he stays away and doesn't hurt them and lead them to sin and all this horribleness. So it's quite possible that the Mayans embraced Christianity, but via their worldview. But Diego de Landa didn't get that and ultimately destroyed them and their culture. This is an image of the Auto de Fe and all the people who were publicly tried and many of them executed for rejecting the faith. Another element I think is really interesting is looking at modern day Mexican art, because again it shows this syncretism, right? This blending of the original culture with this new Christian culture coming in. And what we see is the common ground of Aztec art and Christian art and beliefs, which is sacrifice, right? One of the ways that the Christian missionaries were able to reach out to the Aztecs and some other American peoples was via the idea of sacrifice, right? The Aztecs believed in sacrifice because it kept the gods happy. Christians also believed that there was the holiest sacrifice of Jesus, so they preached that a lot and emphasized that. And we still see that carry over in Mexican Christian art today. All right, so I want to show you some examples from my travels from my early 20s when I was living in Mexico. And what you notice is that the art in Mexican churches does not look like Christian churches in Europe nor in the United States. They are very, very bloody, right? Which again is very similar to the Aztec art. So specifically in southern Mexico, where I lived in Oaxaca, there's this town called Tlacolula, which has these churches that have some of the bloodiest, goriest art. So here is Jesus in the tomb with many of his wounds on here. Right? We just don't see this in a lot of North American or European art. So here's Bloody Sacrifice Jesus. In another church, we see Jesus as well. Always very morbid scenes, but also we can see a lot of offerings here. So surrounded or covered by pictures of people with there's old prayers on the backs of their pictures and family rosaries and other items. There's still this idea of leaving very physical offerings on the statues, which is a carryover from early Aztec culture or pre-Columbian culture. This mostly just made me laugh. It was a really interesting feature in a lot of Mexican churches. You'd be wandering around, and Jesus would be in a very surprising place. I was actually in this town, Aguascalientes, and I was sneaking in to watch this wedding because they would be open to the public. So I came in the main door, which was here, and there was this pew that just was on the very back side. And then, like in this weird corner, is this statue of Jesus. When I sat down, he scared me very much. And later I asked, why is it that Jesus would be in these really random places? And they said it is kind of a reminder that Jesus can be anywhere, so watch out. But also something that we see in pre-Columbian culture, that the gods and their statues would be placed everywhere as a reminder of their power, right, and how you should seek to serve them. These are bad pictures because I had to sneakily take them with a crappy disposable camera way back when, but also in southern Mexico in this Tlacolula church. This is St. Peter bleeding from his wounds. It's kind of hard to see, but he is super beat up, right? He was martyred by the Romans, and so he has this massive head wound, and he's stabbed in the chest. So really gruesome stuff. This, I forget which saint this is, but here he is shown in the church in flames, so being burned at the stake. This is Saint Sebastian. He was shown stabbed with many arrows, so he was shot up with arrows is his story, right? So that very openly shown in this church. Oh, I mostly just really like this picture. When visiting near Cancun, having a nice beach day, this guy rolled up selling religious wares. And obviously people sell stuff on the beach, mostly like ice cream and things that cool you off. But this guy rolled up with a bunch of religious iconography. And I thought for sure nobody was going to buy anything. But within minutes, he was sold out, right? Because, Latin American culture loves Catholicism. So interesting little summer job. And yet another element is Dia de los Muertos. To me, this is an excellent example of syncretism, a true blend of Aztec culture with Catholic culture. So Dia de los Muertos, also known as Day of the Dead, which you might have studied if you take Spanish, was originally an Aztec holiday that celebrated the dead. They believed around harvest time was a time when the living and the dead were best able to communicate. And so they would leave offerings at the tombs of their loved ones with the hopes of being able to connect to them. When the Spanish come to the Americas, they find that act appalling, but they were trying to compare it to a Catholic holiday. So they compared it to what's known as All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day, which is a Catholic holiday in which you honor the saints and personal loved ones who have passed. So they blend those, and now it's known as Day of the Dead. But if you look at the imagery is very Aztec, right? Skulls were a huge part of Aztec art, and so now the sugar skulls are a big thing in that. The altars are honestly very Aztec. The idea of leaving food for your dead loved ones as if they're going to come back in spirit form and enjoy the sweets that you're leaving them. And people go and throw big parties and vigils and at the cemeteries to visit their loved ones. It's a really beautiful holiday. I highly recommend visiting Mexico during that festival. I think it's a very healthy way of looking at death, but is also, to me, one of the best examples of syncretism, blending the early Aztec culture with the Christian culture. All right, that's it for now. Here I am eating a worm. Goodbye.